Theodore Roosevelt was the 26th President of the United States, serving between 1901 and 1908. After decades of various government positions at both the state and federal level, he would become Vice President in the William McKinley administration. McKinley would be assassinated in early 1901, and Roosevelt would assume the presidency, winning re-election in 1904. Who was Theodore Roosevelt? He has certainly left his mark as a titan of the executive branch on the American mind. When Mount Rushmore was completed in 1941, the artist Gutzon Borglum chose to place Roosevelt among Washington, Jefferson, and Lincoln in grandeur. Roosevelt is often looked at as a great president by all sides of the political spectrum. He is seen as the ideal American who personified American exceptionalism and masculinity. Roosevelt was the first media president at a time where it was expected that presidents would not meet with the common people and press. He brought a charm and charisma to the office that seemed irresistible to voters. Millions followed his every word and exploit, and he invited this kind of popularity through rousing speeches and off-the-wall antics. Roosevelt championed the rights of labor and the poor while in office. He governed much like Bismarck had in the German Empire, with a strong focus on social welfare, labor rights, and government intervention. He was an unapologetic imperialist who dreamed of making the United States into a great world power. He could be patient and diplomatic in one sense and jingoistic in the other. He had many enduring positive qualities, but he is not without criticism. His story is one of triumph, failure, and of loss. For the remainder of this video, I'll be referring to Theodore Roosevelt as TR, a common acronym used during his lifetime. TR was born in New York City. His family had originated from Dutch immigrants who had become prominent in New York high society since arriving in the mid-1600s. TR did not have to struggle for wealth due to his family background and was able to focus on education, being homeschooled by private tutors and then attending Columbia Law School. He grew dissatisfied with his profession and decided that he wished to become one of the governing class. TR gravitated toward the Republican Party, where his father had been a notable member. TR was elected to his first political office as a member of the New York legislature in 1882. He began focusing on anti-corruption issues, which had an upsetting effect on the Republican machine politics of the state. TR was brash, unapologetic, and very popular, winning re-election in 1883 and 1884. He attempted to win the position of Speaker during his second term in the New York Assembly, but was defeated 41-29. With the 1884 presidential election looming, TR threw his support behind Senator George F. Edmunds, a reform candidate from Vermont. The New York GOP preferred to nominate the incumbent president, Chester Arthur, for another term. His attempts would ultimately fail, as James G. Blaine was able to win the nomination through swaying the delegates of both Arthur and Edmunds to his side. The Republican reformers, known as Mugwums, asked TR to join them in support of Grover Cleveland, the governor of New York and Democratic nominee for president. TR had been quoted in saying that he would offer support to the Democratic nominee after Blaine had secured the nomination. He would later walk this comment back after being questioned by journalists. TR realized that he had to support Blaine to maintain his position in the GOP. This severely hurt his reputation with the Mugwump reformers, and TR decided to retire from politics and move to North Dakota to operate a ranch in Medora. Grover Cleveland would then go on to win the general election of 1884 by a count of 219 to 182 in the Electoral College. Republican leaders asked TR to run for mayor when he returned in 1886. This was considered to be a long shot, and he did in fact end up losing to Democrat Abram Hewitt, who took 41% of the vote. This was a three-way race, with TR placing third with 27% of the vote, next to Labor Party candidate Henry George at 31%. Politics once again took a backseat as TR spent the next 2 years focusing on writing about the westward expansion, which was later published and made decent sales. In 1888, Benjamin Harrison won an upset victory in the Republican primaries against Blaine. TR supported his candidacy and made several speeches on his behalf around the Midwest. Harrison would win the general election that year against Grover Cleveland. As president, Harrison appointed TR to the U.S. Civil Service Commission, where he would serve until 1895. In 1892, Harrison lost the election to Cleveland, but TR remained at his post under the new president. The idea of TR running again for mayor was suggested to him in 1894. He declined due to personal reasons involving his wife, but later regretted this as a missed opportunity. Another GOP reformer would win this election and appoint TR to the Board of Police Commissioners. As president of the board, he made sweeping changes to the New York City police force, such as frequent firearm inspections and fitness tests. TR became well known in New York society in this role as tough on crime and an enemy of corruption. In the 1896 GOP primary, TR supported the Speaker of the House, Thomas Brackett Reed. The primary was won by William McKinley, who would defeat Democrat William Jennings Bryan in the 1896 general election. McKinley would appoint TR as Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1897. TR focused on military buildup as his primary mission and took a hard line against Spanish occupation in the Caribbean Sea, specifically Cuba. His rhetoric turned to action after the 1898 detonation of the USS Maine in Havana. McKinley attempted to reach a diplomatic resolution with Spain, but TR ordered several naval ships to prepare for war without approval from his commanding officers or the president. McKinley did not find a peaceful resolution to this crisis and asked Congress for a declaration of war against Spain in 1898. TR resigned his post in the Navy and desired to see direct action against the Spanish in Cuba. He formed a military group referred to by the press as the Rough Riders, who would remain active during the entire Spanish-American War. The group would see combat in skirmishes such as the Battle of Las Guasimas and the infamous Battle of San Juan Hill in 1898. TR would be immortalized for leading the charge up the hill, which appears to be the focal point of his story during this conflict. TR enjoyed the taste of battle, and a friend would later write to his wife claiming that her husband was reveling in victory and gore. The war ended in 1898 with victory for the Americans. TR returned to New York and was persuaded by the GOP to run for the governorship. The GOP were wary of TR's reformist record and had doubts about putting him into national politics. The current governor of New York, Frank S. Black, was unpopular at the time, and the party bosses of New York required a charismatic candidate to face the Democratic challenger. TR agreed to play nice with the party establishment and defeated Black in the primaries. He campaigned hard on his war record and the positive press coverage he had received as a figure of romance. His effort would pay off as he defeated Democratic challenger Augustus Van Wyck in the election by a margin of 1%. TR would alarm Wall Street bankers and businessmen with his rhetoric once in office. He advocated for employers' liability and labor rights and successfully pushed through measures in the legislature to protect women and children, inspect tenements, and establish an 8-hour workday. TR took a hard line against corporations and compared men who had grown wealthy at the expense of others to predatory noblemen. The New York GOP bosses became concerned at these comments and TR's actions in the legislature, asking him to slow down and accused him of interfering in the God-given right for men to run their own business in their own way. They developed a plan to exile TR from the state by putting his name forward for vice presidential candidate in the upcoming election of 1900. The office of vice president at this time was essentially ceremonial and held very little power. TR initially refused this idea and was in turn refused by the incumbent President McKinley, stating that he had concerns about TR's involvement in the Spanish-American War. Regardless, the New York GOP began running newspaper campaigns in favor of the idea, and TR eventually relented at the 1900 RNC. TR agreed to accept the nomination if chosen, but would continue for another term as governor if denied. The party bosses struck deals with other state delegates, and TR was chosen unanimously as McKinley's running mate in the 1900 general election. The Democrats chose William Jennings Bryan for their nominee and a second run at the presidency. The country was doing well economically after the conclusion of the Spanish-American War. Much of this prosperity was attributed to the incumbent President McKinley, who ran on the slogan, "4 more years of the full dinner pill." TR was considered to be a war hero for his role in the conflict and was highly visible on the campaign trail. McKinley fell back to his 1896 strategy of campaigning from the front porch of his home in Canton, Ohio, and thousands would come to hear him speak. His opponent Bryan took the opposite approach and traveled by rail all across the country to speak in multiple venues. TR proved to be a capable running mate as he was able to travel and make fiery speeches. The Republican ticket focused mainly on the victorious outcome of the war and the prosperity that followed as a result. Democrats criticized this approach and attacked the GOP over the insurgency in the Philippines, claiming the war was not over. The Republicans fired back by claiming the war would be over within 60 days of McKinley taking office, but there was troubling signs from the military. Many officers contradicted the president's statements, but nevertheless supported him in the election. McKinley, along with his running mate TR, would take a comfortable win in the Electoral College at 292 to 155 and 51.6% of the popular vote. TR grudgingly accepted the office of vice president and spent the next 6 months partaking in rugged outdoor activities, paying little attention to Congress or the Senate. This would change when McKinley was assassinated in Buffalo, New York by anarchist Leon Cazalegaz on September 6, 1901. TR was on vacation at the time and traveled to meet him in Buffalo. When he was convinced that McKinley was on the mend, he continued his vacation by climbing a mountain. McKinley would take a turn for the worst and die on September 14th. TR was informed and returned to Buffalo to be sworn in as president. TR assumed the presidency at a time when it was considered to be a relatively powerless and ceremonial office. The luster and position of the executive had degraded since the time of Lincoln, who was arguably the last great and important figure to hold the presidency in decades. The legislative power of the United States was primarily held in governorships and Congress, who had successfully reigned in every president since the impeachment of Andrew Johnson in 1868. Johnson's successors during the Reconstruction era would continue defaulting to Congress and generally made very few decisions of any importance. This would change under TR and set a precedent for future presidents to come.